Marbury versus Madison is one of the most clever decisions in Anglo-American jurisprudence. And what Marshall is able to do is to spend almost the entire opinion chastising Thomas Jefferson, his cousin, by the way, who he can't stand, and it's mutual, and then turns around and gives Jefferson a decision for which Jefferson cannot complain, because not only does Jefferson win, but there's nothing to complain about. The loser, Marbury, doesn't lose very much because he's only trying to become a justice of the peace, which does not even come with a salary, but only with fees. And given Marbury's position as a businessman and a banker, he doesn't really need the job. It's mostly honorific. So one way to look at the case is it's a fight about the personal honor of a important man in the Federalist Party versus understanding and developing the Constitution. It's really a great decision, and it's wonderful to teach. I've taught constitutional law most of my career, and it's a great case to teach. The Burr trial shows that Marshall almost always gets to where he wants to get. And so in the Burr trial, Marshall uses the law of treason to get to where he wants to get, which is to end the trial of Aaron Burr. Not because I think he likes Burr. Burr is a thoroughgoing scoundrel that I think very few people could actually like. But again, it's a way of thwarting Jefferson. I think my own view is that Burr was probably committing treason, and that he could have been justly tried for treason because of what he was doing out in the West. But again, we don't really know because it never went to trial. Dartmouth College, I think, is one of Marshall's greatest opinions and his most important opinions, because it sets the stage for the future development of the American economy, essentially by putting the state and private entities on notice that if they're going to develop corporations, if they're going to develop businesses, if they're going to have contractual relationships, they have to put in everything at the beginning. They have to anticipate. And so Dartmouth College does this by saying that essentially the contract between the colony of New Hampshire and Dartmouth College cannot be arbitrarily undone by the legislature, but that in the future, legislatures can put into contractual arrangements, corporate charters, the ability to undo them. McCulloch is often called one of the great state papers of American history, and it is clearly a central piece of John Marshall's Chief Justiceship. It is the decision in which Marshall says, along with Cohens versus Virginia, that the Constitution is indeed supreme and the federal government, where it has the authority, is supreme over the states. The states' rights people hate McCulloch because of its implications. They probably go way, way beyond what McCulloch says in their anger over Marshall. And McCulloch, like Marbury, and in some senses Cohens versus Virginia, illustrate Marshall's genius for writing an opinion for which his enemies have no entry points to attack. He builds a edifice, he builds a wall around the edifice, he builds a wall around the edifice, and then he raises the flag at the top of the edifice and said, "This is it, guys." And there's very little you can do with something like McCulloch. Again, it shows his flexibility, it shows his genius. Gibbons is one of his most popular decisions in an age when many people did not like his decisions, because he is strengthening the federal government and appearing to support the big guy over the little guy. So the Bank of the United States over the people of Maryland, saying McCulloch versus Maryland. In Gibbons, it's just the opposite. He's supporting the ability of people to be entrepreneurs, the ability of people to do things that will help most Americans through entrepreneurial ideas. Again, a very important case, a central case. It's where most Commerce Clause teaching begins. The Antelope is a great tragedy. The Antelope shows John Marshall's deep involvement in slavery. It is one of the many slave trade cases that Marshall hears, and wherever Marshall decides a slave trade case, the slaves lose, the slave traders win. Antelope is only a slight exception to that, in that some of the illegally imported Africans are brought into the United States and freed, but most of them remain slaves. It is a tragic case. It's a dishonest case. I think this is, again, an example of when Marshall wants to do something, he's going to do it, and he doesn't care how he gets there. To give you one example, in the Antelope, Marshall completely trashes the idea of using natural law in a decision. Yet just a couple of years later, in Ogden versus Saunders, which involves a bankruptcy, he writes a very strong dissent, his only dissent in a major constitutional law case, in which he does nothing but extol natural law. So Marshall says you can't use natural law to free black people, but you can use natural law to protect somebody who has a debt owed them. And I think this is an example of his duplicity, his dishonesty, and the fact that he is deeply corrupted because he buys and sells human beings his whole life. He is a great fan of slavery. He loves slavery. He's always buying slaves. And he never, ever writes a decision that helps African Americans. The Cherokee cases are deeply misunderstood, and the Cherokee cases first have to be understood in the context of two earlier decisions involving Indians. So that in New Jersey versus Wilson, Marshall says that land purchased from the Delaware where there was a tax exemption, the tax exemption flows to the purchaser of the land. And some people read this as upholding Indian rights, but of course there are no Indians involved in New Jersey versus Wilson. It's a white man who's looking for a tax exemption. Similarly, he then decides Johnson versus McIntosh, where he basically says that Indians have no rights to the land they are on, that Indians are savages, and they cannot sell their land. Now, what's curious about that case is that the Indians had sold their lands. One doesn't think of savages as being in the marketplace buying and selling land. So Marshall ignores all these and uses the term savages in the opinion. Johnson versus McIntosh sets the stage for removal of all Indians from their lands for the next 70 years. Then you get the two Cherokee cases. In the first Cherokee case, he says that Cherokees are not a nation, which would surprise most people since they had signed treaties. You don't sign treaties with any other entity except a nation. But here again, Marshall is not interested in the rights of Indians. He's interested in the rights of white people because Marshall is interested in seeing white people absorb Indian land. Keep in mind, he himself owns close to 200,000 acres of land, which had once been Indian land and which had not been acquired by purchase from the Indians, but rather pushing the Indians away. So Marshall is sympathetic to landowners. The Cherokee are not allowed to sue in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, even though they are clearly being denied the most fundamental rights. Then you get Worcester versus Georgia. And many historians argue, well, Worcester shows that Marshall is sympathetic to the Indians. But Worcester versus Georgia is not about the Cherokee. It is about the right of a white missionary under a U.S. treaty to go on Cherokee land. And so really Worcester versus Georgia has to be seen as a follow-through to McCulloch versus Maryland, in the sense that what Marshall is saying is the Constitution is supreme, the federal government is supreme, and Georgia cannot interfere in a federal treaty with the Cherokee. But it doesn't do anything for the Cherokee. The other thing about Worcester versus Georgia is it's deeply misunderstood by most historians in terms of what happens. Some scholars still quote in their books the completely made-up quotation from Andrew Jackson that Chief Justice Marshall has made his opinion, now let him enforce it. Jackson didn't say that. There's no record that Jackson didn't say that. And Jackson would never have said that, and here is why. Because the decision in Worcester is that a mandate will go from the Supreme Court to the state of Georgia ordering that Worcester be released from jail. If President Jackson had to be involved in this case, it would have only have been after the mandate was sent to Georgia. Georgia refused to follow up on the mandate. And then the plaintiffs, in this case Worcester, would have gone to the U.S. government, the executive branch, not the judiciary, and asked the executive branch to enforce the federal mandate. So Andrew Jackson could never have said in 1832, let Marshall enforce his decision, because Jackson has nothing to do with the enforcement. But here's the kicker. Marshall never sent the mandate. There is no record that the mandate was ever sent to Georgia, so Georgia never gets official notice from the Supreme Court that they need to let Worcester go. And in fact, if you look in U.S. reports, Worcester v. Georgia is the last case of the term. Marshall reads the opinion, hammers down his gavel, I assume, and says, this court is in adjournment until its next session, which will be the following year. So in fact, Marshall doesn't send the mandate to Georgia because Marshall has now adjourned the court for the rest of the term. So nothing happens. So that's Worcester v. Georgia. I think it's a deeply misunderstood case. By the way, who frees Samuel Worcester? Who gets Samuel Worcester out of jail? Andrew Jackson. And so when people write about how terrible Jackson is in this case, Jackson is the one who subsequently helps to negotiate with Georgia to get Worcester released from jail so that he can leave Georgia and move to what becomes Oklahoma. It is difficult to know how many slaves Marshall owned in his lifetime. We know that he is given one slave by his father as a wedding present, and that in the 1780s and 90s, when he is a very young man, does not yet have children in the early part of this period, and is just beginning a law practice, Marshall buys slave after slave after slave. In the period in the 1780s, Marshall buys about a dozen slaves. This is far more than anyone would need to run a small household in Richmond. Marshall understood from very early on that slaves are a great investment. He kept fairly detailed records of his purchases until he goes to France as an envoy, ultimately leading to the XYZ affair. After that, we do not have any of his business records because he apparently destroyed all of his personal records before he died. What we do know is that in the 1830s, he owns something around 150 slaves in various parcels in Virginia. We know this because first in his wills, and he writes his will 3 times, which is very helpful to historians because we can see how Marshall's estate is changing. So for example, in his first will, he says that he was going to give land to his son, John Jr., and the slaves on the land to his son, John Jr., but because of John Jr.'s embarrassment, John was always having financial problems, and he was probably an alcoholic, so he had substance abuse problems as they existed in the 1820s. He says, I'm not going to give the land and slaves to my son, John Jr. I'm going to put it in trust for his widow, I'm going to put it in trust for his wife and children, that is his grandchildren. However, he then says in the same will that when he dies, he gives the land his son Edward lives on with the usual number of slaves. Now, we don't know what the usual number of slaves is. In a second will, written in 1831, Marshall says that he gives the land to son Edward, the slaves having already been conveyed, that is given to Edward. The 1830 census shows Edward owns 27 slaves. Edward is 25 years old in 1830. He did not buy these 27 slaves. He got them from his dad. Marshall's other sons similarly have large numbers of slaves when they are quite young, and it's clear that Marshall is giving slaves in large numbers, 20s, 30s. He may have given his son Jacqueline as many as 40 slaves when he got married around 1821. Because again, Jacqueline owns no slaves in the 1820 census. He owns more than about 47 in the 1830 census. Jacqueline is a ne'er-do-well. He never makes much of a living. He's a minor politician. He's a physician with a small medical practice. He's not buying this many slaves. But by the way, 40 slaves would make you a millionaire many times over in those days. It's an enormous amount of wealth. In his will, Marshall also says that when he dies, he wants the sons. In his will, he says that when he dies, he wants the slaves on his plantation at Chickahominy to go to his nephew. Now, a plantation is a technical term for Southerners. You don't say you have a plantation unless you have at least 20 slaves. So when I read the Marshall will, I thought, well, there's got to be at least 20 slaves here. And sure enough, it turns out there are more than 60 slaves there. So Marshall has 60 slaves at Chickahominy. He's given 27 to one son. He may have given as many as 40 to another son in 1821. When his son John Jr. dies young, predeceasing Marshall, Marshall auctions off about 30 slaves that had been on John Jr.'s plantation to pay John Jr.'s debts. One of his wills lists the slaves in Richmond. There are about 15 plus unnamed children that are born or will be born from one of the slaves. So when you begin to add this up, and then you find notations in the census such as the John Marshall quarters, and we don't know whether it's slave quarters or something else, but there are a bunch of slaves there. My best estimate is that when he dies, he is in possession of about 150 slaves. And that excludes the slaves that he gave to his son Edward, the slaves that he sold for his son John's benefit, and the slaves that he gave Jacqueline. My assumption is he gave other slaves to his older sons when they became adults as well. So how many does he own in his lifetime? 300, 250? It's hard to know. We may never know. Again, the Marshall land holdings are scattered all over Virginia and into Kentucky. You would have to do county by county studies. You would have to do very careful census records. And that may not get you everything you want. You would need to do also tax records. None of them ever bothered to do the very simple thing of go to the census records and look at the census records and see how many slaves we're talking about. And it's a huge number. My guess is that Marshall would have been in the top 10%, if not higher, of all Virginia slaveholders. And there's one other piece of this. His more famous cousin, Thomas Jefferson, of course, owns approximately 200 slaves when he dies. But Jefferson had inherited all these slaves. There's very little evidence that Jefferson is buying slaves, although Jefferson sells many, many slaves. In the 1790s, he sells at least 85 slaves. So if he had not sold 85 slaves in the 1790s, he would own over 300 when he dies. But Jefferson inherits these slaves. Marshall is buying them, with the exception of the first slave given by his father and then a few more slaves that his father gives him when his father moves to Kentucky and says, I don't need to take all these slaves with me, here's a few more. With that exception, Marshall is constantly out there buying human beings. It seems Often when he's out in the countryside, acting as a lawyer, practicing law, he sees a slave, he buys a slave and brings them home. I think his slave owning affects his judicial decisions in two ways. First of all, the Marshall Court hears 14 cases in which the status of a black person, whether that black person is a free person or a slave, is at issue. Marshall writes the opinions in 7 of these cases, and in each one of these cases, the slave loses. In a number of these cases, a jury of 12 white men in Washington, D.C., because most of these cases for technical reasons are coming out of the District of Columbia on appeal. In a number of these cases, a jury of 12 white men, some of whom would have been slave owners, in a case presided over by a federal judge who was a slaveholder, had ruled that the African American plaintiffs were free. That is, for technical reasons, they had gained their freedom and they were entitled to be free. In each one of these cases, Marshall finds a reason to overturn the decision, to say that no, they are not free, they are slaves. Marshall has been buying and selling human beings his whole life. He is still doing it from his position in the center chair of the Supreme Court. Marshall can personally put himself in the position of a man in Washington who buys a slave and then discovers that the slave is not legally a slave. Marshall is sympathetic to the slave owner, not the slave. In cases involving black freedom, John Marshall always decides for the slave owner, never for the slave, even when a jury of white men have declared the slave to be free. And I think he does that because he is someone who's buying and selling slaves his whole life. He has no sympathy for black freedom. He later in his life will say that free blacks are pests, that they should all be sent out of the country. And he, as a purchaser of slaves, always sides with the slave owner. On the other hand, in those cases where Marshall does not write the opinion, with one exception, slave freedom is upheld by other justices on the court. So it seems clear to me that when Marshall can write the opinion, slaves always lose. Same in the African slave trade. Every African slave trade case that Marshall decides, the illegal slave traders win, and the government does not win, and Africans do not go free. In other cases decided by the Marshall Court, when he is not able to get a full court behind him, slave traders lose, illegally imported African slaves are freed, and Marshall remains silent because he doesn't like to dissent. He is a pro-slavery jurist as much as Roger B. Taney. He simply doesn't say it in the grotesque language that Taney will use in Dred Scott and other cases. The Antelope was a slaver that is involved in the African slave trade on the coast of Africa that is captured by another ship, which is either a pirate or a privateer. Privateer is a private ship that is flying under the flag of a country at war and is essentially used as a naval vessel, which is common at this time. The U.S. used lots of privateers during the Revolution and the War of 1812. The Antelope is captured by this other ship, brought to the New World. The captor tries to sell the slaves on the Antelope in various places, unable to do so, and then heads for the United States. The Antelope is captured by a U.S. Coast Guard vessel off the coast of Florida, and it's curious because the United States has already purchased Florida from Spain under the Adams-Onis Treaty, but the treaty says the full changeover won't take place for another year, so it's ambiguous as to where Florida is. But American law is clear. If you're headed to the United States with illegal slaves, it doesn't matter where the Coast Guard vessel finds you. And it's clear that this ship is headed to South Georgia to sell these slaves because there's nobody buying slaves in North Florida. It's towed into South Georgia, And that leads to a long litigation in which most of the slaves on the Antelope are sold in the United States for the benefit of Spanish citizens who claim that they owned these slaves and that the slaves were supposed to go to Cuba. What's curious is the federal law makes it very clear. It doesn't matter who owns these slaves or what the circumstances are. If they're being brought illegally to the United States, then they can be confiscated and should be sent back to Africa. Instead, they're sold in the United States. It's a tragic case in which large numbers of freeborn Africans illegally brought to the New World end up as slaves for life in the United States. In The Antelope, he says the law of nature has no place in American law. However, a couple of years later in a bankruptcy case, he writes a decision in which he says bankruptcy laws violate the law of nature. And in other decisions earlier in his career, he said that the law of nature is very important for understanding American law. But what he says in The Antelope is that the African slave trade is part of international law and therefore it does not violate American law. But the U.S. has by this time passed 4 statutes making slave trading a crime. It is a crime punishable by death by hanging. And American law is very clear that you may not bring slaves into the U.S. and you may not hover on the outside of the U.S., which is what the Antelope is doing. That's as much a crime. It would be no different than today a ship full of cocaine sitting 15 miles off the coast of the U.S. and say, well, we're not in the 12-mile limit. U.S. can't touch us. Nonsense. Coast Guard's going to go bring that ship in. The African slave trade is like the drug trade of the time. Marshall ignores all this, ignores federal law. And keep in mind, this is a man who's always enforcing federal law. He's always saying, federal government wins, federal government's important, strong federal government, except when it comes to the African slave trade. Francis Scott Key argues the American statutes. He argues the law. He says the law is very clear. Hovering off the coast of the United States in a slave ship is a violation of federal law, and therefore we confiscate the slaves. Berrien makes arguments which are essentially about slavery. Berrien says if you condemn the slave trade, then you're condemning slave owning itself. And of course, Marshall's sitting there owning a couple hundred slaves. And Berrien comes from Georgia, where slavery is central to the economy. Robin Spurlock is John Marshall's slave. He is the slave that his father gave him when he gets married. He is his personal servant. The story of Robin Spurlock is another illustration of Marshall's relationship to slavery. Robin travels with Marshall. They're kind of friends. Marshall jokes about Robin. There's one famous story where they're going off, Marshall's going off to hear cases, and Robin forgets to pack trousers for Marshall. And so Marshall doesn't have the proper suit to be a judge in court. But he laughs about it. He doesn't whip Robin. There's no sense, by the way, that Marshall is a personally cruel individual, that he's going to have Robin whipped for this. By the way, we cannot know, of course, the treatment of Marshall's slaves out on plantations where he has overseers. And it is simply wrong to say that Marshall's slaves are all treated well. We don't know that. But Robin's treated well. And when Marshall is very close to death, he adds a codicil, an addition to his existing will, saying that it is my desire that my faithful slave Robin be freed, if he so desires. And this is really curious language, because what slave wouldn't desire to be free? Well, Robin in the end doesn't become free because Marshall sets up circumstances that make it impossible for Robin to accept the freedom. Robin is going to be given $100 if he will move to Liberia, which is a place in Africa where some former American slaves live. Robin, of course, was born in Virginia. He's never lived in Africa. It would make no more sense for Robin to go back to Africa than it would be for me to go back to the Poland that my family left more than 100 years ago. Why? He's not from that part of the world. So, but Marshall says, I'll give you $100 if you move to Liberia. He says, I'll give $50 if you'll move to any of the northern states where free blacks can live. But he will give him nothing if he remains in Virginia, even though by this time Robin is in his late 60s, if not a little older. He spent all his life in Richmond. Furthermore, Robin can't stay in Richmond without a court order. Now, Marshall knows this. Marshall's a very good lawyer. Marshall could have put in his will, I direct my executor to hire counsel to go to court and get Robin permission to remain in Virginia as a free man. He does not do that. He could have said, for his faithful service, I give Robin $100 to start life in Virginia. That's a lot of money in those days. That's enough to get started. Instead, what he says is, I'll give you $100 only if you move to the continent of Africa, $50 if you'll move away from all of your family. And then he puts in the will, and if he chooses not to accept freedom, Robin has the right to choose a master from any of my children. So Robin stays with Marshall's daughter. Okay, so the Cherokees live in a swath of land that includes North Carolina, Georgia, and I think a little bit of Tennessee. But the government of Georgia would like the Cherokee to leave Georgia and go somewhere else. The Cherokee have a area of land, today we would call a reservation, the Cherokee Nation. They have been given that land by a U.S. treaty. The treaty protects their rights to be there. Georgia is trying to move them out. And probably President Andrew Jackson would like to see the Cherokee move out as well. As a general, Jackson negotiated numerous treaties with the other tribes in the Southeast known as the Five Civilized Tribes, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Most of them moved to the Indian Territory, which is today Oklahoma. The Cherokee don't want to leave their ancestral lands. They're in kind of North Georgia where they're not particularly affected by white movement into Georgia until gold is discovered nearby. And then people are moving in. They want to get rid of the Cherokee. And so that sets the stage for the two Cherokee cases and ultimately the final Cherokee removal in 1837 and 38. So he makes up a term. He says the Cherokee are a domestic dependent nation. Now, there's never been this term in American law. The Cherokee have a treaty. Treaties are between nations. And all of American law up until that time talks about Indians as Indian nations. This is the nomenclature at the time. And in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia says, no, they're not a real nation. They're a dependent nation. And therefore, he says, the Cherokee have no right to sue the state of Georgia under federal law because they don't come in the under the jurisprudence of the United States, under the jurisdiction of the United States for a federal lawsuit against the state of Georgia because they're not a foreign nation, they're a domestic nation. And that means that they have no recourse to the courts. Samuel Worcester is a Presbyterian minister who moves to the Cherokee Nation and is working with the Cherokee. Most of the Cherokee, at least the leadership of the Cherokee, but many of the other Cherokee as well, have become Christians, and Worcester wants them to become Presbyterians, so he's trying to convert them to the Presbyterian faith. Worcester goes to the Cherokee Nation to live in violation of a Georgia statute which says that white people cannot go to the Cherokee Nation without a license from the Georgia government. Worcester is prosecuted under Georgia law, and he appeals his conviction to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there, Marshall says that Georgia has no power to prosecute Worcester because Worcester's right to go on the Cherokee Nation is protected by a federal treaty between the Cherokee and the United States. So, it's so weird because in the previous year, the Cherokee are not a nation. But now Marshall says, well, wait, they have a treaty, and the treaty's federal law, and all treaties and all federal laws are something the states have to respect, and therefore Worcester has a right to go because the treaty says he has a right to go. Only the U.S. government can tell Worcester that he can't go. And so Worcester is prosecuted, he's convicted, he's sentenced to jail. He appeals in Worcester versus Georgia. Marshall says Worcester must go free, but Marshall never sends the mandate from the court to the Georgia jailer to free Worcester. And so Worcester continues to sit in jail. And nothing happens until finally Andrew Jackson intervenes and promises the state of Georgia that we will get a new agreement with the Cherokee. The Cherokee will be gone in 5 years. And in return for that, you have to let Worcester go. And so Worcester is let out of jail with the promise that he will never return to the state of Georgia. And Worcester goes off and lives in what is today Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's what happens to Worcester. By the way, Worcester initially says he's not going to leave. He'd rather stay in jail. He's got kind of the notion of Christian martyrdom. His Presbyterian friends all tell him, get out of Georgia while you can. And he does. So Worcester v. Georgia is part of another issue, which involves a federal tariff. Congress has passed a federal tariff. The state of South Carolina objects to the federal tariff, and the state of South Carolina has passed a law saying that it nullifies the federal tariff. And Jackson is furious at South Carolina. Jackson allegedly says, and this is something I think is probably he did say, that he will personally come to South Carolina and personally hang the governor of South Carolina if they interfere with the federal government. And Jackson has a record of personally hanging people. He'd hanged 2 British agents in Florida when Florida was still part of the Spanish Empire. Jackson is a pretty tough guy. Here, by the way, is a fascinating parallel between Jackson and Marshall, because both of them are strong nationalists. Both of them oppose and hate states' rights. So actually, in the case of the tariff, Marshall and Jackson would have been like this. They would have both agreed. South Carolina can't nullify a tariff. Federal government has a right to force them. And had the tariff case come before Marshall, Marshall undoubtedly would have given Jackson an enormous victory, because Marshall and Jackson would agree on federal power in this way. Now, in order to get Southern support for his coming down with both feet on South Carolina, Jackson is ready to make a deal with Georgia to help get rid of the Cherokee. So part of the new Cherokee Treaty is tied to nullification. He's basically telling Georgia, if you support me on nullification, I will support you on Cherokee removal. Keep in mind, of course, Jackson was born in South Carolina. He is a native of the South. He is a slaveholder. He is a Southerner. He is in a strong position to stare down the nullifiers. I want to give a footnote to this, which is this. When Lincoln becomes president and the Civil War begins, the United States has to demonetize all existing postage stamps, because postage stamps function as currency, or really as change. If you don't have pennies, you can go buy a bunch of 1-cent stamps and they function. Okay. By demonetizing stamps, what he says is the postage stamps are no longer valid. The reason for that is because there's millions of dollars worth of postage stamps in Southern post offices. U.S. prints a whole new set of stamps, and one of them is a 2-cent stamp known to philatelists as a blackjack, which is a very, very fierce portrait in black of Andrew Jackson. Lincoln loves Andrew Jackson because Andrew Jackson stood up to the South Carolina nullifiers in the 1830s, just as Lincoln is doing in 1861. After Worcester v. Georgia, the United States imposes a new treaty on the Cherokee. It's a treaty that probably the majority of the Cherokee are opposed. It's questionable how it gets implemented, other than the United States has the power to do it. Says, here's the new treaty. The new treaty says you have 5 years to leave. The Cherokee believe that they will not have to leave, or many of them do. Many of the Cherokee have faith in the United States Constitution. They have faith in law. The Cherokee are very Americanized, if you could use that term, towards a native population, which of course is an oxymoron because they were Americanized from day one. But they are, in fact, many of them living lives similar to fellow Georgians. They are slave owners. They own African American slaves. They are cotton planters. They are farmers. They have now a written language. They have a written set of laws. They have a newspaper. They have become Christians. And they're saying, hey, this is our land. We want to stay here. And they believe that they will be able to win in the courts. Marshall dashes those hopes in Cherokee Nation. And in Worcester v. Georgia, he doesn't give the Cherokee a victory. He gives the United States government a victory because he's upholding the treaty. After that, the U.S. government essentially tells the Cherokee, you have 5 years to leave. Go out to Oklahoma and find the land you want to live on, and then get ready to move. Some Cherokee make preparations. Most Cherokee do not. Most Cherokee resist until the end. And by the time Jackson leaves office, nothing much has happened. Van Buren becomes president. Van Buren does a disastrous job of overseeing the Cherokee removal. The Cherokee are not prepared to leave, and the Army brutally treats the Cherokee in what is known as the Trail of Tears, which is this march from Georgia to Oklahoma, where a substantial number of the Cherokee die along the way. But the Army is not prepared for it either. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough blankets. The Army doesn't have the preparations to move the Cherokee, and part of the march is in winter. I mean, it's a disaster on all sides, but the U.S. government, if it's going to remove these people, should have and could have done a much better job and avoided the massive loss of life that the Cherokee suffer. It's one of the great tragic moments of American history. It's one of the great blots on the honor of the United States. It's a disaster all the way around. Both in Georgia and in Oklahoma, there is a mini civil war within the Cherokee Nation between the people who are cooperating with the removal because they feel they have no choice, and the people who are essentially saying, we will not cooperate at all. You have to understand that the mini civil war within the Cherokee is a conflict between people who on both sides have very little power to control their own destiny and are arguing among themselves about the best way to respond to what is a tyrannical moment in American history. How do we deal with his rhetoric about the Indians in what is known as the Indian Trilogy, which is Johnson versus McIntosh, Cherokee Nation, and then Worcester versus Georgia? In Johnson versus McIntosh, he says, and let me just read it so I get the language exactly right. It would seem, therefore, to be unnecessary and merely speculative to discuss the question respecting the sort of title or ownership which may be thought to belong to savage tribes in the lands on which they live. I think that's the essence of John Marshall, that these people in the end are savages. Now, what's odd about this is that Johnson versus McIntosh involves the sale of land. We don't normally think of savages as negotiating to sell their land. And in fact, the Indians who had once owned this land have moved on and sold their land. So this again is a suit between white people over who owns land that once belonged to Indians in Illinois. If they're negotiating to sell land, it's hard to imagine that they are savages, even in the context that Marshall is using them. What Marshall says in Johnson versus McIntosh is that Indians have no right to the land they live on. They never had a right to the land they live on. The land doesn't belong to them. It belonged to England or France and now it belongs to us, and that they can live there as long as we choose to allow them to live there, and then we have the right to move them by treaty, by purchase, or by force if we so choose. So basically what he says in these decisions is Indian people, the natives of the United States, have no rights that the Constitution respects. By the way, it's very similar, although not as harsh, to Chief Justice Taney's language in Dred Scott, that blacks have no rights that the white man need respect. He's basically saying the same thing about Indians. If he is sort of saying, these were once great people, he can afford culturally to do that because there are no Indians left of any meaningful number on the East Coast, or the few that are, such as those in New York, have been pushed onto reservations. And so he can kind of be nostalgic for the Indian people as long as we've kicked them out, destroyed their nations, sent them away, obliterated them in some cases. But I don't see any sympathy to the Indians. If he had sympathy to the Indians, he would have concluded in Cherokee Nation that the Cherokee Nation has a right to defend its treaty, its land, its space in court. And keep in mind that even if you buy Johnson versus McIntosh, that Indians in the West don't own the land and we have a right to push them out. Once we've made a treaty with them, once we've said it's your land, once we have the solemn full faith and credit of the United States government behind being on this land, then how can Marshall say they have no right to defend that in court, which is what Cherokee Nation does? I see no sympathy for the Indians any more than I see Marshall having any sympathy for African Americans. So Marbury versus Madison involves the failure of James Madison, who is the Secretary of State, also the father of the Constitution, involves Secretary of State James Madison's failure to give William Marbury a commission, which is a signed document saying that he is a justice of the peace in the new county of Washington, which is the creation of the national government in the District of Columbia. Marshall goes at great length in the opinion to explain why Marbury is entitled to the commission. And he says denying him the commission is a violation of law, it's a violation of justice, and while he doesn't mention Thomas Jefferson, he's pointing his finger at the Jefferson administration. He's saying that Marbury was duly commissioned by the previous administration. His commission was signed by the president and the Secretary of State. It was sealed, it was wrapped up, and the fact that it didn't get put in the mail is irrelevant. He's entitled to his commission. It is worth remembering, of course, that John Marshall was the Secretary of State who signed that commission, and it was John Marshall whose failure as Secretary of State led to Marbury not getting his commission. If John Marshall had been a better Secretary of State, he would have made sure that the commissions got sent out on time. He failed. His brother Thomas was busy delivering commissions, didn't deliver them all. But aside from that, aside from, should Marshall have recused himself because he was a party to this failure in the first place, what Marshall says is the Jefferson administration has a political, a constitutional, and a moral responsibility to give the commission to Marbury. Goes through the whole case, and then he says, but there's one problem, which is that Marbury has come to the Supreme Court and asked for a writ of mandamus to be directed at the Secretary of State, ordering him to give the commission. And we cannot issue a writ of mandamus because that would be an act of original jurisdiction. And Congress cannot add to the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And therefore, what Marbury has to do is start all over again in the district court and let it work its way up. Okay, so Article 3 of the Constitution, which sets out the powers of the Supreme Court, says that in a certain class of cases, the Supreme Court can have original jurisdiction, which means the case begins in the Supreme Court. That's what Marbury is trying to do. However, the same clause of the Constitution ends by saying, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. And so one could easily read Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution as saying that the Supreme Court shall have the original jurisdiction as the Constitution lays out, and any other jurisdiction under such regulations as Congress shall make. So presumably, one could easily read this clause to say Congress can add to the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, but not subtract from the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The other question is whether a mandamus is in fact adding to the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, because it's not actually hearing a case, it's simply sending an order, which all courts can do under certain circumstances. But Marshall doesn't want to go there because Marshall doesn't actually want to decide the case. And the reason he doesn't want to decide the case is because he's pretty sure that if he sends a writ of mandamus to James Madison, Madison will ignore it under Jefferson's orders. He's pretty sure that Jefferson will tell Madison, you may not send this commission to Marbury. And so Marshall wants to avoid a crash between the court and the president because Marshall knows he's going to lose. When I first read Marbury versus Madison, I'm reading how he is giving all of these reasons why Marbury gets the commission, and I'm thinking, did I learn this wrong when I read it, when I read about it in a textbook? Are the textbooks all wrong? It looks like Marbury's going to win. And then you get to the very end and say, oh no, by the way, you don't win, and here's why. So it's a very brilliant opinion because it gets Marshall to do what he wants to do without the confrontation between Jefferson and Marshall. And the fact is, nobody cares whether William Marbury gets a commission. It's a meaningless job. It's an honorific job. Doesn't even have a salary. He only gets fees if he actually works. And it's not clear Marbury would have actually wanted to be a justice of the peace. He just wants to be able to call himself Justice Marbury. Thomas Jefferson hates Aaron Burr. And he hates Aaron Burr for a variety of reasons, but most of them stem from the election of 1800. In 1800, the presidential electors under the existing Constitution vote for two people. The original Constitution says that the Electoral College will vote for two people. The person with the most electoral votes gets to be president. The person with the second most electoral votes gets to be vice president. Jefferson runs with Aaron Burr. It's Jefferson and Burr. And when the electors vote, all of the Jeffersonian electors vote for both Jefferson and Burr, all assuming, well, Jefferson will be president and Burr will be vice president, because that's how they run. Curiously, when the Federalist electors vote, they all vote for Adams and his running mate, except one Federalist elector who is singled out to vote for somebody else as the second ballot. So there won't be a tie between Adams and his running mate. Okay? But there's a tie between Jefferson and Burr. And the Constitution says if there's a tie, then the House of Representatives chooses between the two. Okay? Now, what Jefferson expects Burr to do is to say, well, I don't want to be president, I want to be vice president. That's what I was elected to be. But Burr has two responses to that. The first is, under the Constitution, I am equal with Jefferson here, therefore I have just as much right to be president as Jefferson. But Burr also makes a different argument, which is very interesting. Burr says that I can't decide to be vice president. The Constitution doesn't give me the option of choosing, vote for me for vice president, vote for Jefferson for president. And the Constitution doesn't do that. So, in fact, there is no option but to have it out in the House of Representatives. In order to win in the House of Representatives, you have to have a majority of the states. There are 16 states. Therefore, you need 9 state delegations. There are 8 state delegations that have a majority of Jeffersonians. And so on the first ballot, all the way through, I believe it's ballot 34, Jefferson gets these 8 states, okay? The other 8 states, 6 of them have Federalist majorities. They can't vote for Adams because he's not in the running. But they despise Jefferson so much that they vote for Burr. Burr is a Northerner. Burr went to an Ivy League school. Burr is from New York. And so many of these Federalists who are Northerners say, we'd rather have Burr than Jefferson. There are also, by the way, some people who will vote for Burr because Burr is not a slave owner and Jefferson owns hundreds of slaves. And so Jefferson is just not somebody that Northerners want to support. So you go through ballot after ballot after ballot, with Burr never stepping back, Burr egging the Northerners on. The other 2 states have an equal number of Federalists and Jeffersonians, and so their votes don't count because it has to be within the state delegation. This, of course, is one of the absurdities of the Constitution, that each state is equal in this. So Virginia, which has, like 50 times the population of Delaware, gets 1 vote. Delaware gets 1 vote. In the end, the final play is actually negotiated by Alexander Hamilton, who convinces a couple of the Federalists not to show up for the vote. And so in those tied states, the states go to Jefferson, and Jefferson gets elected president because a couple of Federalists simply don't show up to vote. They're not going to vote for Jefferson, but they don't show up to vote for Burr, and so the states are no longer tied. So Jefferson never forgives Burr for this. He considers this to be Burr's dishonesty, that Burr is a scoundrel, and so that's why he wants to try him for treason. The politics of the Dartmouth College case is this. Dartmouth College is this old college that is a bastion of the Federalists, the political party that is in opposition to the Jeffersonians. The legislature of New Hampshire is controlled by Jeffersonian Democrats, and they say we are tired of having this private college training the elite, training our political opponents. Let's dismantle Dartmouth College as it exists, make it into a state university. And by the way, that means we don't have to appropriate tax money to have the University of New Hampshire. We simply make Dartmouth the University of New Hampshire. And now it'll be for the real people, that is Democrats. And so they pass a law abrogating the charter for Dartmouth and creating the new Dartmouth College. And Dartmouth College v. Woodward is a suit between the old Dartmouth College and the new Dartmouth College. Jefferson, of course, who is a supporter of the Jeffersonian Republicans. It's hard to know what to call Jefferson's party. Sometimes they're the Jeffersonian Democrats, sometimes the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes they're the Democratic Republicans. I just call them the Jeffersonians because it's easier. It will later be the Democratic Party under Jackson, but right now it's the Jeffersonians. So Jefferson supports the Jeffersonian government in New Hampshire. So he's giving the governor advice on how to deal with Dartmouth College, because if they can seize Dartmouth College and turn it into a state university, then Princeton might be next, Columbia might be next, Harvard might be next, Yale might be next. If they can take over the state legislatures, they can dismantle all of these private colleges that tend to be supported by people who oppose Jefferson. And of course, the Dartmouth College case is argued by Dartmouth's most famous alumnus, Daniel Webster, who's one of the great lawyers of the time. And again, Webster is on the political side opposite to Jefferson. So that's Jefferson's interest. John Marshall is a Revolutionary War soldier and patriot who becomes one of the most successful lawyers in Virginia after the Revolution, moves into politics, becomes a national political figure, first as a diplomat, then as the Secretary of State under John Adams, and then becomes Chief Justice of the United States in 1801 and remains in that position until his death in 1835. And he is the longest serving Chief Justice. And he shapes the Constitution in many ways. He shapes the Supreme Court. He also dominates the Supreme Court. And so the decisions of the court under Marshall are Marshall's decisions. It's Marshall's court. He is clearly the most influential legal player, at least in the first 50 years of the history of the United States. And he is considered to be the great Chief Justice. He has, I think, two main objectives. The first is to strengthen the United States government, to strengthen the Constitution, to strengthen the Supreme Court. His second main objective is to protect private property at all costs. A theme that runs through all of his decisions is the importance of private property, land, and slaves, and investments in banking, investments in new industries. He is a private property guy. And you see this in almost all of his decisions. And he rants and raves when he thinks the court is not protecting private property, as in the bankruptcy case of Ogden v. Saunders. And I think that, again, Marshall is often portrayed only as the defender of the Constitution, defender of a strong national government, which he does. But you also have to see that it's all about private ownership, private property. John Marshall as, quote, the indispensable man, as the great man in history. Without him, history doesn't happen. I don't buy that at all. There were many other people who could have done what John Marshall did. John Marshall did it, and so he is honored in many ways because he did it. But he's not the only person who could have done this. I think what might surprise him about the judiciary today is how successfully it has become an integral part of the American process in the way that it was not under Marshall. Keep in mind that while Marshall is seen as the guy who solidifies the Supreme Court, how many U.S. statutes does he declare unconstitutional? One. There's only one. So if you read the textbook, it says, John Marshall invented judicial review. He used it exactly once. He never, ever strikes down another federal statute. In fact, there are only two federal statutes that are struck down until after the Civil War. John Marshall strikes down one, Taney strikes down the other in Dred Scott. So I think Marshall might be surprised at how powerful the court has become in being able to willy-nilly strike down state laws, strike down federal laws, take acts of Congress like the Voting Rights Act, which have been repassed over and over again and have been upheld by court after court after court. And suddenly a court can say, oh no, Congress is wrong. It can't protect voting rights in the South. That might shock Marshall because he would not have had the guts to do that. And I don't think he would have thought that would have been appropriate as a way for the court to act. Marshall is actually very solicitous of legislatures. He strikes down very few state laws. He overrules state courts. But there are very few times when Marshall is striking down state laws. And so I think he would be surprised at the way in which the court has taken his lead and expanded itself in ways that I think would surprise him. He would not, by the way, be surprised by the politicization of the court. He lived in a political court. I would like to talk about why he never, ever, ever found a way to allow a black person to become free. I would like to know why, when juries in Washington, D.C. said that if your mother was never a slave, you can't be a slave, Marshall overturned that. I would like to know why, when his own court set a precedent in slave trading cases, which said that if a slave ship is taken over by a privateer, that the previous owners of those slaves no longer own them, why he didn't apply that precedent in the Antelope, which would have meant that all the slaves in the Antelope go free. So I would like to know that, but I suspect he would not give me a straight answer. I'd love to discuss Marbury versus Madison, and more important, McCulloch versus Maryland, the bank case, because it's really, truly a great case. They would be interesting discussions.